Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Revolutionary Agency stage. The theme of this session is International Strategy for the Coming Revolution. So we've got people coming from different sessions to be here, and even from different places in the world. And we're living in difficult times, times of war, poverty, mental health crises, and fascism revealing itself, just to name a few. We're stronger by coming together, and that's what this festival is doing. So you should be aware that this session's being recorded. If you don't want to appear on the recording, then just don't speak, because it just shows the person who's speaking. And breakout rooms won't be recorded. So we're going to be hearing from Roger Hallam. Roger is one of the world's top campaigners, famous for being a founder of Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain, and Just Stop Oil, the most prominent social movements of recent years in the UK. Rogers worked as an advisor around the Western world, facilitating the creation of significant climate campaigns in Italy, Germany, and Sweden, and has been committed to social justice for decades. So I'll hand over to you, Roger. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Um, Being slightly overwhelmed by that description. I'll have to say something extra impressive now. Anyway, hello everyone. I just noticed a few people I know. Hi Jane. Hi Andrew. Right. So the plan is, well, I think the plan was there's going to be more than me, but unfortunately, you've only got me partially because I've been madly busy doing an election campaign in the UK, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But having said that, I am to a certain extent going to speak on behalf of um, an ongoing process of work, which has been happening mainly in Europe around creating an international movement, which people have been thinking about for a long time, a sort of XR 2.0, as you might say, that looks at preparing for the revolutionary changes which are now inevitable, as has been discussed. So I'm not going to say anything particularly original in a way. I'm just going to do a bit of a progress report on what the thinking is of various people from various movements on what could or should be happening. So I hope that's going to be okay. I'm hoping not to speak for too long. This is my famous last words, of course, but so that there can be breakouts and you can all, get in your breakouts to discuss, whether it's any good, as you might say. And then we'll come back and hopefully have some time for questions. And as I said in my initial remarks at the beginning of today, there will be a follow-up international meeting to discuss some of the things I'm going to talk about, in so much as people are interested. So so I'll just get going, I suppose. Well, the first thing to say, it's very easy, isn't it, to sort of have these sessions and go straight into that instrumentalist mode. Oh my God, we've got to make things work. It's got to happen, and we'll get slightly stressy in our ego heads about it. So I just want to remind ourselves that we're on this planet, for 70, 80 years, hopefully, and the main issue for our lives is to live a good life and know how to live a good life. It's not to be successful. And hopefully that relaxes us a bit when we actually come to the work of fulfilling our responsibilities for the years that we're in this world. So hopefully everyone can calm down a little bit and not get too stressed about how we're going to sort everything out in the time we've got left and all this sort of stress zone that we find ourselves in. It is what it is, as one of my cellmates told me on regular basis when I was in prison, and it is what it is. Having said that, I think another sort of initial comment is there's an awful lot of stress also because everything's so shit and nothing's really happening, and a lot of the movements around the Western world are not at a mass development stage, as you might say. And I talk to a lot of people that are a bit miserable about it. And, there's good reasons to be miserable, obviously. But I would like to suggest that to a certain extent, that shows a sort of lack of understanding about how revolutionary processes work, in the sense that as things get worse and worse, people don't revolt as a general rule. They tend to become distracted or depressed, and things don't uh, don't move off in a linear fashion, as you might say. And we are certainly at a period in history when the level of social repression and individual repression is at its maximum. And there's a good reason for that, because if we looked at the world objectively, then we'd be shitting ourselves so much that we'd have to do something really dramatic. And lots of people don't want to be shitting themselves and do something really dramatic. And so they just want to pretend that it's sort of okay. So the paradox is, as things get worse, then less happens, not more. Having said that, of course, that's a temporary sort of pre-revolutionary phase, the calm before the storm, and we need to understand to be mature enough that there will be an explosion, and when the explosion happens, it will be a massive explosion of social activity when it sort of tips that the world is actually totally fucked as we know it is. So, I'll just give you a little example of how this works. So, last night I was at the count for the local elections in a suburb of London, and the Green Party has gone from 4 seats to probably 30 seats. So the poor Green Party has been labouring away, as you probably know, in the UK since 1974. And for several decades, it's had 1 seat and then 3 seats and then 4 seats and then 2 seats and 4 seats. You know how this works. It's all a bit depressing. And suddenly in one night, they basically go from 4 seats to a majority on the council. So, so the thing to take away from here is not whether the Green Party is great or not great. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to communicate in these initial comments, which I'll try and move through a bit faster, is this is how history works. Everything's useless, everything's appallingly depressing, and then suddenly out of nowhere, you're thrust into greatness, as Shakespeare said. And this is how it's going to work. And so really like what I'm going to be talking about here is not about how we're going to burn ourselves out by being super successful in the next 3 months, right? That's not going to happen. What we need to focus on is preparing for the moment when we're thrust into greatness. And that moment objectively is going to come because, as we all know, we're dealing with physics and the climatic collapse is going to come. It's locked in, and this will inevitably cause massive disruption. The issue we need to focus on at this moment in history is, have we got a strategy? Have we got an ideology? And have we got an organization and a culture that's coherent and ready to be expanded rapidly at the moment of the major ruptures that are coming down the road? And the word here is coherence, right? And this is what a lot of social movement sort of strategists have been thinking about, and people I work with, you know, some people that are better than me in these matters. And that's what I'm going to go through is what is the proposition? What is the revolutionary strategy? What does coherence look like? Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through a few things relatively quickly just to sort of provoke you all, I suppose. And then, because as I said, I'm very interested in you guys talking to each other as much as having to hear me ramble on. But I think an overall meta theme here is the idea of an integral approach. So for the last, 100, 200 years, revolutionary theories usually rotate around binaries, sort of anarchism versus Leninism, the center versus the decentralized, all this sort of stuff. And the sort of smart thinking, I suppose, is to think, yeah, well, as with most things, it's six of one and half a dozen of another. There are good reasons to try and integrate the various poles in a creative way, so the revolution in the 21st century can move beyond these suboptimal sort of like, extreme positions. So I'll go through, a bunch of them for those who like the sort of high theory side of things, and then I'm going to obviously get on to more practical, organizational, and sort of tactical matters. So the first thing that's created a little bit of conflict on all this work is this notion of, are we actually going to create the revolution? Are we going to react to the ruptures when they happen? So obviously you can make two extreme positions here. It doesn't matter what social conditions are. We're just going to create this amazing movement and we're going to overwhelm the opposition, and regardless of what social conditions are. Well, maybe, but probably not. Or the other extreme position is like it's all hopeless. We might as well go home and watch Netflix, and wait until there's a big rupture, and we'll just potter out to claim the state once capitalism's collapsed upon itself. So these are quite boring extreme positions. The smart thinking is that you're basically doing both. What you're doing is you're confronting the system to the extent you have the resources to do it in order to trigger a revolutionary episode in so much as objective conditions are really bad. And at the same time, you're building a movement, an organization that can respond quickly to, the biggest forest fires in Australia, since whenever. And both of those are important. It's not like it can be both and it should be both. So that's one thing. The other thing is about the relationship between the state and society. And, those of you that like political theory, probably can talk about this for hours. But as some of you probably know, people have been arguing about the role of the state, since whenever, 1880 or. But the smart thinking on this is if you have a complex society, you're not going to get rid of the state in the sense that national decisions need to be made, right? You've got a national community, that's a physical reality. You've got social complexity, that's a inevitable reality. But that doesn't mean you're going to end up with some Leninist nightmare where everyone's being sent off to the gulags, right? So this notion of a state, the Leninist position versus the anarchist position is a little bit unhelpful. The smart thinking is thinking about how do you transform the state, i.e. the decision-making hub of society, into something that's humane and democratic and participatory. And I'm not going to go into it in great detail, people can ask me about this, but the smart thinking is broadly what I would call assembly-based governments, right? You can get rid of the word government if it triggers those of you with more anarchist persuasion. But basically, the realistic thinking is what we are moving towards is a form of decision making where people are selected randomly by sortition from the population in order to make decisions. And a lot of sort of left-wing sort of Marxist people give me a hard time when I talk about this because they say, oh, the main aim is to be, to get rid of capitalism. Well, obviously, like that begs the question, well, how do you do it? Well, how you do it is by giving ordinary people sovereign control of their societies. And how do you do that? You do it by having sovereign-based, legally binding citizens' assemblies. In other words, like this is the chicken that lays the golden eggs. If you want to reduce inequality, then basically it's a political problem. It's about who controls the state. And how do you control the state effectively? Not by having a revolutionary party that's going to break people's legs. What you need is a citizens-based, assembly-based orientation. And lots of the sort of sensible anarchist people have been saying this for 200 years. And there's variations on the theme, of course. So, that's the plan. That's the top line plan. In terms of what the strategy is, and this doesn't really come from me necessarily, but I've got a friend who some of you may know, Michaela in Italy, and various other people have been saying like the strategy has to be based around the social questions, right? So in the good old days, 7, 8 years ago, it was, what we want is better democracy, what we want is climate. What the new strategy is about starting where people are at. And there's a long tradition again of this conflict between what is real and what people think is real. Do you go for the purest stuff of what you think are the big issues, or do you start where people are at? In which case they might not be objectively the biggest issues, but in terms of mobilization potential, you have to start where people are at. So the big sort of meta trend, I think, is amongst the movements is to move towards starting where people are at. But it has a strategic like sophistication in so much as it's self-aware that these issues are not the show, right? It's mainly a mobilization strategy in the sense that You can go and knock on the doors of South London, and we know what the biggest issue is, which is housing. Well, we know, housing is a function of capitalism, and capitalism is a function of a dysfunctional state. Blah 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 blah. But Mrs. Jones, on housing estate X, is not bothered about capitalism. What she's bothered about is getting her repairs done on time. And she'll certainly join a revolution to get her repairs done on time because she's so fucked off. The point here is there's free uh, the idea is to go into the social space and animate people who are already pissed off on the issues that are already important to them. And so that's another sort of binary, as you might say. The heart of the strategy is to combine three different elements, which in the neoliberal period have been separated. While in the classical revolutionary period, from 1780 through to 1989, this strategy was a little bit of a no-brainer. And in some ways, it shows how sort of separated we have come from historical experience. That what I'm going to tell you in a minute might sound a bit weird, but the proposition is this: there's basically three elements of revolutionary activity. There's mutual aid, i.e., communities coming together and providing for themselves. There's standing in elections and winning elections and getting into legislatures. And there's civil resistance, which is strikes, and demonstrations and all the rest of it. Now, in the neoliberal period, all those have been separated off. And as a result of being separated off from each other, they've what's the word? They've declined in their vigor, let's put it like that. So what you end up is boutique little movements or projects, oh, we're growing food in Melbourne, it's like, oh, fantastic, but what does that mean, right? Is there a strategy? No, there isn't. So I keep looking at Andrew and Jane for some reason, very inspiring individuals. Where am I up to? 20. Oh, yeah, I've got to get a move on. So the point here is we need a sophisticated ecological view about cause and effect across different spaces. So when someone says, oh, we're doing mutual aid in Sheffield or whatever, that doesn't mean that they're not going down to a demonstration in London, right? There's 24 hours in a day. You don't need to use 24 hours of your day, weeding carrots in Sheffield. It's like, no, at the weekend, you can go down and sit in the road in London, if you see what I mean. A lot of people have been in prison in the UK, as many people know, including myself. But that doesn't mean like we're not going to go to prison again. It just means for the moment we're not going back to prison because it's not actually particularly strategically useful. So now we're doing election campaigns. But we're not just going to do election campaigns forever. We're keeping an eye on this broader picture, the interaction between the two. And a lot of people have done civil resistance, and then people tend to be reductive about civil resistance. They go, oh, we've done civil resistance and it didn't really work. No, no, no. Like the process of doing civil resistance creates a culture and organizational capacity that then can be exapted and moved into other areas. So, whether they're different areas of civil resistance, like a lot of climate people in the UK have moved into the Palestine space, for instance, and brought the organizational solidity and cultural, benefits of that into another political space. So what we need to see here is a flow between these different spaces over time, with individuals being involved in each one. The issue here is the revolutionary consciousness that if you're doing a Palestine campaign, you're not doing a Palestine campaign because you don't like what's happening in Palestine. You're doing a Palestine campaign in order to build a revolutionary movement that will involve mutual aid and elections. You see what I mean? It's like this all works together. And in classical revolutionary movements or left movements in the 20th century, this was a no-brainer, right? On Thursday night, you go to your mutual aid society, to get, money for your mum because your mum was ill, right? On Saturday, you go to a demonstration and you go, and then you stand for the Labour Party or whatever in the elections every May. You didn't separate these things out. There wasn't electoralism. There was a strategy of the left bringing down capitalism. That was the strategy. It wasn't about standing in the election and going through the motions. All right. So this is quite, difficult to get across, of course, to people that have been involved in the neoliberal sort of space for a long time. Um, all right. So in terms of what's concretely happening in terms of the international movement, I think there's three ideas, and then I'll try and shut up. So the first idea is the idea of creating a single international brand. Now, as soon as you say this, all the sort of horizontalist people have a nervous breakdown because they go, "Oh, this is going to be really oppressive, and who are you, and you're being imperialistic, and all the rest of it." The fact of the matter is historically, fascism is only defeated by mass movements, and we need to get over this whole notion that you're doing that over there, and we're doing this over here, and this is our brand, and this is your brand. So the method, and the big example of this, of course, is the Communist Party in the 20th century. Now, obviously, I'm not saying the Communist Party was great for obvious reasons, right? But it did have a massive, like, benefit that there was a single international communist movement, right? And it had a name. It was the Communist, it's Communist Party and all the rest of it. And it did elections, it did mutual aid, and it did a bunch of other stuff. So this is the vision, which might sound ridiculous, but this is what we think needs to happen. We don't really care what it's called, and we're not saying, hey, we're it, and this is the international movement. Everyone has to join us. We'll create an international movement, and when we bump into another international movement that is fundamentally the same, then we'll change the name and call it something else until so we can aggregate. It's not a matter of saying everyone joins us. We can join other people, but it needs to have an international ambience, a little bit like what XR did for a year or two when there was a big, everyone around the world was going, oh, it's in XR. And of course, this has the massive advantage of creating, identity and the excitement because everyone knows unless this movement is international, we might as well not get up in the morning. It's like we're dealing with an international capital situation. So that's one element to it. The other element is it gets concretized. At the moment, it's getting concretized around training and fundraising and inspiration. So these things are already happening. This is one of the things we're doing today is people from lots of different areas are coming together and being inspired and learning from each other. There's a number of training agencies which obviously are really important in terms of, say, giving people the skills. And then there's the fundraising. There's some plans to raise £1 million, for instance, this summer to feed into these various movements. There is a sort of tipping point that's happened where lots of rich people are shitting themselves over Trump and they want to give money. So, the last few years there's been hardly any money. That's not the situation anymore. But they do want to see something that's cool, right? They're not going to give, a load of money for a mutual aid project in Sheffield. What they will give money for is an international movement to stop fascism, right? And you have to go into the room with those 20, 30 groups with a name, with a strategy, and say, give us your fucking money, in a nice way or not so nice way, depending on what mood you're in. And that's a new situation. So lastly, yeah, there's a bunch. The last thing, and this is where we move on to what you might call mid-level design, right? Which is we actually need to know. I mean, I assume most of you are thinking about this at the back of your mind. Oh, Roger's rambling on again. Like, what does this actually concretely mean? What it concretely means is we need what I call like mid-level modules, right? Mid-level design modules. In other words, we sort of know how to organize breakout groups. We'll do one of those in a minute. We sort of know we're going to have assembly-based government. The issue is what mutual aid projects actually work around the Western world. And what we need is 5 pages, 30 pages, videos, training events where you can learn how to set up a city-based food cooperative, right? We're not talking about little boutique, grow your carrots in a little allotment in Sheffield. What we're talking about is how can we provide sustainable food production for 10% of Sheffield? Okay, well, they've done it in Sydney, right? All right, so how did they do it? And there's a document about it and there's training and you can learn how to do it. So for instance, in the UK, this thing called what's it called? Uh, Something town, food town, I think I've forgotten what it's called. But basically, like it's food co-ops for poor people, and there's 60 of them in the UK, and it's spreading really rapidly, and they've got this module. So module is something that works and you can replicate it. A cooperative town. Yeah, sorry about that. No one's saying like it's the last word on the matter, but it's good enough to go. So we've just done like a campaign in a borough in London, as some of you may know, and we've got 1,000 people on WhatsApp, and we've got 15, 25% of the vote in 12 weeks campaign, and there's at least a 50-page like training manual to come out of this. So that's basically how you can go into working class communities and basically create independent candidates and get into legislatures. And there it is. It's not last word on the matter. Um, and such like, right? There's a bunch of things like housing, how to do housing campaigns around the Western world. There's loads of housing campaigns. Why is no one doing rent strikes, right? Fuck knows why no one's doing rent strikes. Everyone's getting exploited to death, and no one's actually doing a rent strike. Well, why is that? Because no one's actually worked out how to do it. But they have. I did one 7 years, 8 years ago before XR, and got 10,000 people not to pay the rent, and it won. So that's something else that we might be doing in London. But obviously, the whole idea is people can come together, and maybe this movement will have 20 modules, right? Of different activities people can do. And then the best ones will rise to the top and become more well known. Um, so I'll stop there because I'm on 24 minutes or something. Um, so that's the state of play. But please come to the follow-up meeting, obviously, to find out more. I know several people, quite a few people on this call are sort of involved in these networks already. But um, but that's the state of play. And yeah, you might get some money. It's always important. Right, that's it. I will stop.